fiscal space. Okay. In an environment of constrained fiscal space, rising financing costs, and significant development challenges. So today's discussion is taking place at an important moment. Developing countries continue to face significant financing needs to invest in infrastructure, human development, climate action, and the Sustainable Development Goals, while at the same time confronting higher borrowing costs, debt servicing pressures, and limited fiscal space. UNCTAD's report on external flows of financial capital to developing countries and their cost, which provides the basis for today's discussion, examines the scale, composition, the scale and composition of external financial flows to developing countries, and most importantly, the cost of that finance. So our discussion today will go beyond asking just how much financing is available. We will also consider who can access it, at what cost, under what conditions, and whether the current international financial system is adequately supporting developing countries' development and ambitions. So today we will begin with a presentation of the key findings of the report that I just referenced. We will then move into a panel discussion with a particular focus on the African perspective, including the role of regional cooperation, domestic resource mobilization, taxation, and reforms to the international financial architecture. And we will conclude with an opportunity for questions and answers, as well as other interventions from the audience. Before we begin, I would like to make just one housekeeping announcement. Please keep your microphones muted unless you are invited to speak, both your microphones and videos. And we also encourage you to submit your questions through the chat box. We will try to address as many of them as possible during the dedicated Q&A segment. However, because there'll also be an opportunity to speak during that session, we invite you to raise your hand and make your intervention at the time. So with that, it's my pleasure now to introduce Mr. Keith Lockwood, who is a Senior Economic Affairs Officer in UNCTAD's Debt and Development Finance branch, to present the key findings of the report, Financing Development, External Flows of Financial Capital to Developing Countries and Their Cost. Keith, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, and good afternoon to everyone. It's very good to be with you. This is work that we did in the Debt and Development Finance branch of UNCTAD. We were busy on it for quite some time, so it's very good that it's seeing the light of day, and I'm very happy to be sharing it with you. Just by way of introduction, I mean, part of the reason for focusing on this particular area was linked to the fact that we had a particular focus from South Africa under the G20 presidency on the cost of capital. And we thought it was important that we should take initially at least a broad view on capital flows. And then, as you will see, the analysis that we conducted led us to focus increasingly on the debt components of those flows. But I think, given that many of you might not yet have had a chance to read the report, the objective here really is to give you an overview of our findings, and then hopefully that can lead into some productive discussions going forward. Okay, so firstly, let's start out, as the report does, by mapping the scale, cost, and volatility of those external financing flows. Here we are illustrating the flows in 2024, which is the last year we have comprehensive data for. And it's important, if we start on the left, you can see we have different functional categories of flows. So this is as defined in the balance of payments. So we start out with direct investment flows. Then we add portfolio investment, other investment, and then we have included external transfers from other governments. As you can see, that's not particularly significant value, but it is important for some countries. What we haven't included is personal remittances, which is significant in scale, but for reasons that we go into in the report, we decided it didn't really fit the remit of this analysis. You can then break up those flows, those functional flows, into particular types of instruments. So either equity instruments or debt instruments. And you can see that although external direct investment is predominantly made up of equity instruments, it does have a debt component to it. And then likewise, portfolio investment is predominantly debt-based, but it does have an equity component to it. So if you think about investments into stock markets, you could be buying equities in particular companies, or you could be buying debt securities, and those would be debt instruments. And then external other investment also has a very small equity component, but is predominantly made up of debt instruments. So in total, we have just under $1.5 trillion worth of new external flows flowing into developing countries in 2024. And we have gross capital formation of about 13.4 trillion. So that leaves a gap of close to 12 trillion that comes from domestic financing sources. What's important to recognize is that if we look at a kind of equivalent analysis of flows just for Africa, we see some differences, fairly noticeable differences in the composition of those flows. So one of the interesting things here is that quite a significant portion of equity instruments, of direct investment is coming in the form of debt instruments. Now, I'm assuming, because the data doesn't actually give us a lot of detail, but I'm assuming that would probably be debentures or convertible debentures, where you have initially a debt instrument that might at some point be converted into equity. And then you can see that so that the dominant instruments are definitely debt related. And we also see in the table on the right that comparatively speaking, African countries are quite a bit more dependent on external transfers from other governments. And then they also have quite a significantly higher other investment instruments, or debt instruments rather. And that comes from this combination of other investment, which is predominantly made up of loans. The portfolio investment component is debt securities, is relatively smaller. And then there's a fairly significant portion of direct investment, which consists of debt instruments. You can also see that new external inflows are proportionately more significant in their contribution to the financing of capital formation than is the case for all developing countries. Okay, so if we go back to looking at the overall picture for all developing countries, we can see that there's an existing composition of inflows combined, making up about 13.4 trillion. But we know from work that's been done in UNCTAD and elsewhere that there's a significant shortfall in the amount of financing that's available. That's been estimated at $4.3 trillion per annum. And so if we were to source that 4.3 trillion in proportion to existing flows, then it would mean we'd need additional domestic finance of the order of $3.8 trillion per year. We'd need additional equity finance of about 230 billion per year, and a similar amount for external debt finance. And then relatively small additional value of bilateral transfers. So in essence, it means that each of those components would have to increase by about a third on their current levels. Okay, so what we have seen, though, is that compared to a decade earlier, almost all developing country groups have become significantly less, and I wouldn't say dependent is the right word, but the source or external finance has become a less significant source of their financing of gross capital formation. So in the case of all developing countries, it's dropped from 20% in 2014 to 11% in 2024. And we see similar kind of declines across different categories. Now, it's a terminology that's not necessarily well known. So EME stands for emerging market economies. Those are generally countries that entered global capital markets in the 1990s. So they've been in those markets for some time. Frontier market economies, generally low or lower middle income countries that accessed global capital markets after the 2008 global financial crisis. And then other developing economies are those that are generally have low levels of integration into global capital markets. From an African perspective, we see that the proportion of funding coming from external sources has dropped by 11 percentage points from 37% to 26%. So it's still significant in an African context. At least a quarter of financing for gross capital formation is coming from outside sources, but it has become less significant over the last decade. And we can see what the impact of that has been. So the bottom light blue line is showing the non-resident financial inflows. And the first thing that stands out there is that it's exceptionally volatile. So you have these peaks and troughs, it jumps around a lot. But over the period, it has declined by around 18%. So from 2014 to 2024, dropped by 18% in value terms. Over the same period, domestic financing increased by around 60%, and that allowed gross capital formation to increase by around 45%. But what you can see is that domestic financing since 2022 has been pretty flat, and gross capital formation has also slowed dramatically as a consequence of these financing dynamics. Compositionally, there are quite significant differences as well. So important to note that developed countries remain, on average, much more dependent on external flows. Although they experienced a small decline, they still were getting about 38% of their gross capital formation financing from external sources. But compositionally, they are much more dependent on portfolio investment inflows and other investment. And again, just to remind you, so portfolio investment consists of equities and share in companies, but it also consists of debt securities. And then other investment is predominantly loans from external sources. And in an African context, again, you can see this compositional dependence, firstly on direct investment. It's relatively high, not as high as Asia and the Pacific and Latin America. But it has a relatively small component of portfolio investment, which talks in part to the relatively low levels of integration of many African countries into global capital markets. And that leaves a relatively higher dependence on loan capital in other investments. Okay, so the accumulation of these financial flows, less any valuation adjustments and principal repayments, ultimately gives rise to a stock of liabilities. So the stock of liabilities we can analyze both in functional terms, as direct investment, portfolio investment, and other, and in instrument terms as equity instruments or debt instruments. And at the end of 2024, that was sitting at pretty much close to $31 trillion for all developing countries. 57% were in the form of equities and 43% in debt. Now, of course, having these liabilities means you have to service them, and that results in payments which are channeled through the primary income account of the balance of payments. So we can see, if we again start on the left-hand side, we've got the returns paid by developing countries of just over $1 trillion, and that comprised about $670 billion of direct investment servicing, 186 billion of portfolio investment servicing, and 212 billion of other investment servicing. And if we look at the instrument components, then it means profits and royalty payments of about just short of 690 billion, and interest payments of just under 390 billion. So what's important in this context is just think, remember we had inflows of 1.5 trillion almost, and now we've got outflows of close to 1.1 trillion. So that means that in a year like 2024, 72% of the new inflows of capital were flowing back out to non-resident investors in the form of returns on their accumulated investments. And that doesn't include the principal debt repayments, and it also doesn't include some of the illicit financial flows that we also know are important, particularly in an African context. Okay, so once you've got these stock values of the liabilities and you've got these flows in servicing those stocks of liabilities, then you can work out what the average costs of each of those different liabilities were. So here we're showing the dark blue lines are developed country average costs, and the light blue lines are developing country average costs, split into the functional categories of direct investment, portfolio investment, and other investment. And you can see that although direct investment costs, which are the costs in the context of the recipient countries, but they also constitute returns to the non-resident investors. But those have been averaging probably somewhere between 6.5% and 7% over the last 10 years or so. A big dip during COVID, not surprisingly, but otherwise relatively consistent. But you do see that the returns in developed countries have gradually begun to converge with those of developing countries. When it comes to portfolio investment, quite a different picture emerges. So here we see a very substantial and quite consistent gap and premium that is paid by developing countries. So remember, a significant portion of this is debt security. So this is a good reflection of the risk premium that markets are ascribing to investments in equities, yes, to some degree, but also debt securities in the main. And then on other investment, which again, mainly loans, here we can see that although there was a fairly consistent premium paid by developing countries over much of the period, it did converge as monetary policy in developed countries tightened in 2023 and 2022, but now we're seeing the gap emerging again. So in all areas, developing countries have consistently paid quite a significant premium on their different sources of capital. Regionally, although it's a little bit noisier, we see similar trends. So here, Africa is the orange line, and we can see direct investment returns, I guess, have been trending lower. So probably averaging around 6% or just over the period. Then we see Asia and the Pacific, which is the dark blue line, increasing quite substantially in 2024. Latin America, likewise, has been sort of following African trends to some degree. Portfolio investments slightly lower, and then other investment, we see Africa so far experiencing relatively less of an increase in interest costs on other loans, partly because they have, or more countries in Africa have access to concessional lending in this context. All right, so one of the things that emerged from our analysis is that we have this very volatile or very, very volatile inflows of external capital. We do see that their costs have gone up substantially. And then we also see that in scale terms, they're not really meeting the needs of or really managing to close that gap. But the main reason for that is related to debt securities, or sorry, debt instruments in general. If we contrast what's happened with equity liabilities, we see that the stock of liabilities has increased fairly consistently and steadily by about 53% over this 10-year period. And the stock has actually increased faster than the cost of servicing that stock. So the average costs of servicing have actually been going down. When it comes to debt liabilities, a very different story, however. The light blue line is showing what's happened to the cost of servicing the stock of liabilities. And we can see that since 2014, it's increased by 111%. It would have been a relatively consistent and straightforward increase if we didn't have the dip in the COVID and immediate post-COVID period, and that was linked largely to the debt service suspension initiative. But outside of that, we see these costs have increased steadily and generally 2.5 times as fast as the underlying stock of debt liabilities. We see quite similar trends in relation to Africa, although in the debt space, actually even more pronounced. So equity liabilities increased by 25% over the 2014-2024 period, whereas the costs actually decreased by 30%. So, I mean, this could be part of the reason why there's this increasing preference for equity or for direct investment being funded by debt or convertible debenture instruments and things like that, rather than straight equity to begin with. But on the debt side, we see that over this period, debt liabilities costs have increased by 204%, while the actual underlying stock of debt has only increased by 41%. And the actual debt stock for Africa has been very flat for pretty much since 2017, largely unchanged. Okay, so that's the first part of the analysis, is just looking at the scale, cost, and volatility of these external flows. Now let's just think about what that actually means in developmental terms. So the first instance, we know governments in developing countries are still quite dependent on external financing. It does vary quite a lot across different regions. It's more pronounced in Africa than elsewhere. But nevertheless, we know that external interest costs on debt have a direct impact on interest costs paid by governments in developing countries, but they also have an indirect cost, because we see that external interest trends tend to be mirrored by domestic interest costs. So in this case, we start out with government revenue increasing by 39% over this 2014-2024 period, while their interest costs have increased by 102%. So a similar sort of 2.5% or 2.5 times faster increase in interest. And of course, that translates into more and more government revenue having to be devoted to servicing debt, and that leaves less space, less fiscal space for spending on SDGs and other things. So in total, 73% of developing countries lost fiscal space over this period. And the scale of those losses vary. So in some cases, or the majority of cases, somewhere between 0 and 5%, but in other cases, it gets above 15%. We did then a counterfactual exercise to say, all right, so if developing countries could borrow money at the same rate as is enjoyed by developed countries, what would that save them? And the reality is about a quarter of developing countries already borrow at rates similar to those of developed countries, China being a notable example. So if we exclude them and just focus on the countries that are currently paying more, that's sort of 94 countries. Those 94 countries would save in the order of $500 billion per year in interest costs if they could borrow at the same rate as developed countries in Europe, America, Japan. So what could you buy with that 500 billion? Well, you could feed 1.6 billion children each year, a minimum dietary diversity diet. You could build 375,000 additional schools, which would have space for 375 million children, based on the average size of a school. You could build 66,000 kilometers of dual lane rural highways, or 24,000 kilometers of high-speed railway tracks. You could build 1.3 million primary healthcare centers, or you could add an extra 920 gigawatt odd of solar generation capacity to grids. And this would be every year. Okay, so it's oral. Each of these is taken as you're spending the 500 billion exclusively on that thing. But obviously you could have a mix of these and you could repeat that year after year. So it would make a huge difference to development progress and processes. Okay, so having identified that debt-related dynamics are the principal reasons behind the high cost and volatility of external financial flows, we now delve a little bit more deeply into sovereign debt financing. And you can see here the composition of sovereign debt financing. So here, the split, the blue bars, dark blue, mid blue, and light blue, reflect loans from different sources. Some multilateral organization loans are the dark blue, bilateral are the mid blue, and private loans are the light blue. Collectively in 2024, those contributed 57% of total debt financing. And then debt securities, which are reflected in the orange bars, effectively are sourced from private, either commercial banks or private investors, and those comprised 43% of the total. So although loans are still the dominant feature, the important thing is that, particularly if you take a longer term trend, debt securities have grown at a much faster rate than loans. So if we look at what's been happening on the debt security front, and we look at the average yields to maturity of developing country sovereign bonds compared to benchmarks from countries like the United States, Germany, and Japan, then you can see that we have this period between 2015 and 2020 where yields are fairly stable and consistent, averaging somewhere around 5%. Then we have the COVID spike, immediately following that, a big dip. And then after the start of the Ukraine war, we see yields pushing up dramatically. And although the yields have been trending lower for developing countries, there's still this fairly significant gap between borrowing costs in developing countries now relative to what they were pre-COVID. It's also important to note that the term of borrowing has worsened. So both in terms of coupon rates for new issues and in terms of the maturity of the lending. So whereas pre-COVID, countries were generally able to issue bonds with maturities averaging around 15 years, that's now dropped to under 10. And the coupon rate is sort of sitting back at its 2015 levels. But this is quite a selective base because relatively few developing countries have actually gone to market and been able to issue bonds. And we know that in many cases they are issuing bonds if they're able to at significantly higher rates than this average. All right, so that's linked to the debt securities. If we look at the loan trends, then we can see how even at that level, the interest costs have shot up. And it doesn't matter whether you are talking about bilateral lending, multilateral lending, or private lending. The increases have all been very pronounced. And in part, even though we might associate multilateral lenders with concessional lending, it's important to note that their lending is still benchmarked against prevailing federal funds rates and things like that. So they, when those rates go up, concessional lending rates also tend to go up at the same time. And then we also see that although maturities have remained relatively steady, it's still, if you want to borrow, you're going to get much longer term loans from bilateral and multilateral lending, somewhere between 20 and 25 years. But if you're borrowing privately, then you're going to only be able to get maturities of around 10 years. Okay, so quickly, what drives the cost of these external sovereign debt finance? We separate this out into two different categories, really: the external or push factors, and then domestic or pull factors. And on the external side, we know monetary policy decisions in developed countries have a very pronounced impact on borrowing costs. Investor risk appetite also is a very important driver of external costs. Global exchange rate dynamics obviously play a role here. Because of the opportunity cost issue, bond yields in developed countries also become important. There is this issue of mispricing, so information asymmetries and things that lead to external borrowers mispricing the risks or overestimating, in many cases, the risks associated with investments in developing countries. Then we've got the whole question of climate shocks and natural disasters, which have added to the risk premiums that developing countries face. And then there's just the basic supply factor that we know that the amount of development finance available has dried up, especially that's available to developing countries. I mean, ODA is one component that has undergone significant declines, but we also know that the amount of of capital available to multilateral development banks and things has not been growing significantly in line with the needs. And then on the domestic side, there's no doubt that countries have a lot of agency to address things like their credit risk. So macroeconomic policies, stabilization policies all become important in that context. The exchange rate risks are very potentially significant and can be managed better. There's liquidity risks, which I think are a very important element and linked to how countries can access the global financial safety nets and regional financial safety nets. And then there's also mispricing issues in the context of domestic factors. In many cases, because governments are not actively engaged with markets the whole time, they don't always appreciate what an appropriate price in the market is. And so we do see these situations where, particularly in Africa, we've had bond issues which have been oversubscribed 5 or 6 times. And although that might be termed a success in one context, it also suggests that the issue has been mispriced. Okay, so to finish off, the report then looks at what policy approaches could we pursue to try and bring down these costs and ensure better access to external debt finance. And again, we can differentiate between national level measures, where countries have control and agency. And so issues like strengthening macro frameworks and institutional quality are paramount there. There's a lot that can be done around structuring debt portfolios more effectively, changing the composition of your investor base. There's also a significant amount that could be done in terms of data transparency and investor communication. So I know in the African context, credit rating agencies often come in for a lot of stick, but we do think it's important in how we respond to that to try and break the monopoly hold that rating agencies have in their kind of gateway to communicating with investors. And we think countries could do a lot better in communicating directly with financial markets themselves. And then there's significant capacity to improve debt issuance and market timing. So in many cases, countries are going to market at the wrong times. Perhaps they're desperate under certain circumstances, but if they had a kind of more active market issuance, they could smooth out some of these profiles and borrow at better terms. And then there's a lot of scope to use innovative financial instruments in a more effective way. And then on the multilateral and cooperative action side, it's clear that we need more concessional finance, and that means multilateral development banks and national development banks have to increase the scale of their concessional lending. There's a scope for enhanced technical assistance for debt management. UNCTAD has the DIMFAS program that helps 65 odd countries, but there's a lot more that could be done on that front. The Borrowers Platform is a new initiative that we are hoping will be able to deliver, especially in the form of peer learning, enhance the capacity of countries to manage their debt and price their debt more effectively. It is important that countries invest in climate adaptation and mitigation to reduce their risks, but it's equally important that funding for those kind of activities is scaled up. It's really important, particularly given that you want debt crises to be avoided, that countries should have more effective and less conditional access to global and regional financial safety nets. We have seen this decline in ODA. It seems unlikely that it will be significantly reversed, but we would like to keep reminding developed countries of their sort of implicit commitments to the 0.7% of gross national income. And then there's scope for things like debt service pause clauses to become more standardized, and for that to allow developing countries to adopt almost an automatic debt service standstill in the event of some sort of crisis, whether it's climate or other. And then lastly, fairer and more efficient and predictable international debt restructuring mechanisms. I mean, it's very clear that the G20 common framework is not a favored mechanism based on the experiences of the countries that have used it. But the reality is, if you have a creditor base that sort of matches that, you probably would be forced to go that common framework route. So avoiding restructuring is important, and that links to the financial safety net issue. But it's also important that those mechanisms need to be more efficient and rapid and ensure less damage to countries. Okay, so that's a summary of the report and its key elements and findings. I just remind you that it's available for downloading on the UNCTAD website. So if you go to unctad.org and you just look for under publications, you will find the report. The cover looks like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith, for your presentation, and you've given us a clear picture of both the scale of the financing challenge and the structural factors which are affecting the ability of developing countries to access affordable finance, affordable capital. Just before we go into the panel discussion, I would like to invite Ms. Diane Sainzoga, the Chief of UNCTAD's Regional Office for Africa, to give us a few remarks that will also set the scene before we go into the panel discussion. Diane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Keith, for the presentation. I hope you can hear me. Judith, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
Good. Okay, so distinguished participants, colleagues, and friends, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this webinar on financing development. As Judith mentioned, I'm Diane Sainzoga, the Chief of UNCTAD Regional Office for Africa, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all, policymakers, representatives of international organizations, and the many friends across Africa and beyond. You are very welcome to this session. So let me begin by also thanking you all for joining us for what I believe is a particularly timely and important discussion. We meet at a moment when financing development has become increasingly difficult. So ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to share some reflection on this important topic before we open up for panel discussion. So over the past few years, a succession of global shocks and disruptions has affected financial market investment decision and capital flows. At the same time, developing countries have faced increasing pressure to finance their development priorities while servicing growing financial liabilities. So the result is a difficult trade-off when countries have to devote an increasing share of their resources to securing and servicing capital. Fewer resources remain available for investment in people, in productive capacity, and even in the economy in general. So, and too often, development has been the loser into that whole ecosystem. So this has profound implications for sustainable development goals. Progress toward many of the goals have settled, while an increasing number of targets are falling behind or even regressing in some countries. So the financing challenge is therefore not simply a question of how capital is available. It is also a question of cost, stability, maturity, and condition under which that capital is made available. And this was also presented by Keith few seconds ago. So this is particularly important for developing countries. The cost of capital paid by developing economy is typically at least twice that paid by developed economies. And in Africa, it is often considerably higher. This creates a structural disadvantage. Countries that have some of the greatest development and investment needs are often those facing the highest cost of financing. And this issue has rightly received increasing attention in international policy discussions, including even during the South African G20 presidency. So it is in this regard that UNCTAD developed the report which was presented. And the resulting report provides an important contribution to our understanding of how international capital is reaching the global south, what is costing and what it means for development. So from the presentation, you realize that the findings really tell us something important. And developing countries received almost 1.5 trillion in new external financing flow in 2024. Yet, despite this significant flow, developing countries continue to face an estimated 4.3 trillion annual financing gap for achieving the Sustainable Development Goal. So for Africa, the picture is particularly concerning, and it was presented as well. So Africa received only around 10% of total external financial flow to developing countries, despite accounting for approximately 22% of the developing world population. And the challenge is not only the volume of financing, it is increasingly the cost of that financing. So again, from the presentation, we saw that in 2024, developing countries paid around 384 billion in interest on external debt instruments. And between 2014 and 2024, government interest payments increased by more than 100%, while government revenues grow by only 39%. So the number tells us something fundamental. The financing challenge is not only about mobilizing more resources, it is also about correcting the conditions under which developing countries access resources. So, ladies and gentlemen, this discussion is particularly important for Africa because Africa's economy needs substantial investment to accelerate structural transformation, diversify production, strengthen regional value chains, create decent employment, and implement the African Continental Free Trade Area. So they also need resources to address climate-related challenges, building resilience, building infrastructure, among many other sectors, including the critical minerals sector as well. But this investment requires a patient, predictable, and affordable financing. Therefore, the question before us is not simply how can developing countries attract more capitals. We also need to ask what kind of capital do they attract? What is the cost of that capital? For what duration? And under what conditions? And does that financing ultimately contribute to productive transformation and sustainable development? So these are really the questions that we have to reflect on, all of us, this afternoon. So there are questions that require both national and international responses. At the national level, developing countries can strengthen macroeconomic and fiscal framework, improve debt management, and deepening domestic capital market, as well as diversifying their investment base. And then at international level, this includes increasing access to affordable long-term financing from multilateral development bank, strengthening global financial safety, and improving mechanisms for restructuring and sustainable debt and expanding technical assistance. We also need to continue discussing on the broader international financial architecture and on how it can better respond to the development financing needs of countries in the global south. In this regard, initiatives such as borrowers' platforms are particularly relevant because they provide space for peer learning, coordination, and the sharing of experience among borrowing countries. So today, therefore, it is not simply about presenting a report. It is about using the evidence to stimulate a broader conversation about how we finance development and how we can make that financing more affordable, stable, predictable, and development-oriented. I hope that our discussion will therefore go beyond the findings presented. So let me conclude by thanking the colleagues who have contributed to the presentation of this important report and to the organization of today's webinar, as well as to all of you who managed to join this discussion today. I look forward to a rich and constructive exchange. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Diane, for your remarks. I think now is the time to go beyond the findings that have been presented and explore some of the other questions, specifically what the findings mean in practice, particularly for African economies, and what can be done to improve the financing conditions in Africa. And to help us explore these questions, I am pleased to welcome our distinguished panelists. First is Dr. Patrick Nzana-Olomo, who is the head of Economic Policy and Sustainable Development at the African Union Commission, and he will bring the perspective of the African Union Commission and its Agenda 2063 perspectives to discussion. Welcome, Dr. Olomo. Our second panelist is Ms. Leila Kitui, who is the head of Strategic Partnerships and International Cooperation at the African Tax Administration Forum, and she will be providing the perspective of tax administrations and the critical role of domestic resource mobilization, which we saw from the presentation is increasing in financing sustainable development. Welcome, Ms. Kitui. So I will begin with Dr. Olomo, and this is a two-part question. Dr. Olomo, from the perspective of the African Union Commission, how do the report's findings on shrinking fiscal space, rising financing costs, and widening SDGs financing gap resonate with the realities that are facing African economies today? And secondly, looking ahead, what multilateral and regional policy actions do you see as most critical for expanding access to affordable long-term financing and advancing the ambitions of Agenda 2063? Do you think you could respond in about 7 minutes, Dr. Olomo?
Thank you very much, Judith, and good afternoon to you all. I would like to first of all take the opportunity to sincerely appreciate UNCTAD for convening this very timely and important meeting. And when I say timely and important, on the African Union perspective, it speaks to the reality that the continent is facing today. And the report is absolutely right to highlight the fact that the continent is at a very important shifting moment, because we can see the rising cost of capital that is affecting our economies to finance sustainable development and even to make progress towards Agenda 2063. Let me take one example. Our countries in 2024 paid a combined amount of approximately $74 billion just payment of interest rate relating to debt. And this has led the continent to a situation where it is extremely difficult to finance health, to finance infrastructure, and to finance productive transformation that is supposed to facilitate the repayment of the debt that was contracted. And in that perspective, from the African Union, we have started shifting the narrative from debt sustainability purely to debt productivity. When we talk about debt productivity, we would like to make sure that future debt that will be contracted will speak to the issues of financing sustainable development and financing productive transformation, because that is the only way we will be able to break the vicious cycle that we are seeing today of rising cost of capital in a context that was highlighted also by the report, where we see a decreasing amount relating to official development assistance that has decreased systematically and drastically over the years. And if you take the global economic context today, we are standing at a point where the era of ODA has certainly gone. There is no need for us African countries to expect that ODA will pick up again. If you just look at the geopolitical context, you will see where resources are being channeled. We also have a context where foreign direct investments are decreasing systematically on the continent. And I do appreciate what the report highlighted, that the continent just received 10% of the global financing flows that were relating to developing economies. It speaks to the reality. And Diane was absolutely right when she said that 22% of the population of the globe just received 10% of the amount that was distributed with regards to external financial flows. It tells you the magnitudes of the challenge that the continent is facing and the difficulties in which our countries are navigating. Let me take an example. When a country cannot finance education properly, when we cannot finance health and finance infrastructure, what is expected in terms of development outcome when we talk about Agenda 2063 or the SDGs? Dan also highlighted the fact that we have a gap of approximately $4.3 trillion annually globally for financing sustainable development, which shows the magnitude of the need for financing resources that should be supporting our development. That is why the African Union has consistently been calling for a deep reform of the international financial architecture. And Diane was also right to point out the fact that during the South African presidency of the G20, the continent has been able to be at the forefront of the global reform for the international financial architecture, highlighting the difficulties in which African countries are navigating and facing. It is important to highlight the fact that the continent is paying an unfair risk premium, which speaks to the over-evaluation of the risk on the continent. Because globally, when you look at the available data from the different sources and from the African Development Bank, you can see that Africa has the lowest default rate, for instance, on infrastructure, which is estimated at 1.9 compared to 12.4% for Europe on infrastructure. But unfortunately, on infrastructure, we are paying the highest amount in terms of the resources that we are collecting to finance infrastructure on the continent, which speaks to the reality of the unfairness of the rating system in which we are evolving today, and even the biases in the international financial architecture that is supposed to speak to development issues. When we talk about resources, also financial flows, I already highlighted the fact that the continent has lost in 2024, and in 2025, that amount was even higher, 74 billion in terms of poor risk perception that has escalated into the debt situation that we see on the continent. We also are losing an approximate amount of 90 billion with relation to illicit financial flows. And I remember that Kate highlighted the need for stemming illicit financial flows as a possible source of capital that can support Africa's development. It is also important to highlight the fact that corruption is taking away alone $148 billion per year, and that international profit shifting are also taking away an amount of approximately $275 billion. In total, it means that we have a leakage of approximately $587 billion per year, which shows that per day we are losing an amount of 1.6 billion daily. So it is important for us, as we call for the reform of the international financial architecture, that we also take actions on the continent, and those actions are critical. First of all, we are working with our member states to make sure that we enhance macroeconomic stability on the continent. We had concluded our last ministerial meeting with the ministers of finance and central bank governors in July in Abidjan, where we re-echoed the need for our countries to enhance macroeconomic stability and to make sure that we build the right environment that fosters private sector-led growth and development, and also investment in critical sectors. Secondly, it is important to enhance tax administration on the continent. And I think Leila will be speaking to this. We are already working with our sister institutions such as ATAF, UNECA, Tax Justice Network, and other institutions to support our member states in addressing challenges that we see in mobilizing domestic resources that are still at 16% of our GDP today compared to other regions of the world. So there is a pocket of resources that the continent can mobilize domestically to finance its development. Agenda 2063 even speaks about 75% of resources that needs to be mobilized at the continental level to finance our development. So it is our absolute task to make sure that we mobilize domestic resources that are our own resources to finance our development. The difficulties in the international financial architecture today, the geopolitical tensions, and all the other challenges that we see will certainly worsen and make sure that resources become difficult to be mobilized externally. Now, in terms of those domestic resources, it is important also that our countries work to ensure that they are able to channel the resources towards productive investment in agriculture, in industrialization, and in the services that are required to accelerate productive transformation on the continent. On the international side, and to speak to the last segment of your question, we have advocated and are continuing to advocate for a deep reform of the international financial architecture that we do believe is critical. We contributed to the launch of the borrowers platform that Diane alluded to in her opening remarks. That borrowers platform, we believe, will enhance Africa's capacity, not only Africa, but the Global South's capacity to speak with one voice and to address the challenges that we see in the international debt architecture, which we believe can be resolved. We are also working at the G20 level to ensure that we reform the G20 common framework that is not yet fit for purpose because we only have 4 African countries that are participating in that context. And those 4 countries have been in a very difficult, debt architecture reform that has led to some of the difficulties that the countries are still facing today. Speed, magnitude, and the sense of the reform should be increased to make sure that the G20 Common Framework delivers on the promises. We are also in discussion with international institutions such as the World Bank to make sure that the 3-pillar solution with the IMF works effectively for addressing the debt challenges of our countries. And we are spearheading some of the continental reform to ensure that the borrowers platform becomes effective and that it speaks to the reality of the continent. We are making sure that also reforms that are needed to accelerate progress towards the implementation of the FFT4 recommendations, notably on credit rating agency reforms, be also implemented in such a way that we have a comprehensive global environment that supports development effectively by providing affordable resources to developing economies. So that is what we are doing at the African Union, and we are continuing to push for first continental reforms that needs to respond to the challenges that we see on the continent, but also to the international financial architecture reforms that are needed to support our development forward. With this, Judith, I would like to maybe stop here because I think you said 7 minutes. I don't know if I was effective in respecting that time that we've allocated, or I've been beyond. My apologies if I've been beyond, but the subject is so important that there is need for us to take deep analysis or deep discussions to make sure that we unpack the realities of that very important publication that you have just put forward. So thank you very much, and back to you, Judith.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olomo. And I think if we can spend a couple of more minutes just to get your perspective in on this very important discussion, as you said, I think that is okay. So you've highlighted the importance of looking at the financing challenge at several levels, from the domestic fiscal capacity, regional financial cooperation, and ultimately reform of the international financial architecture. And I especially liked the point you raised about the African Union shifting the narrative from debt sustainability to debt productivity in order to break the vicious cycles of the rising cost of debt. So I'd like to turn to Ms. Kitui now. We have heard about the importance of external financing and the reforms to the international financial architecture. But there is another essential part of the financing equation, which is what can countries do for themselves? What are countries able to mobilize domestically? The ATAF has consistently emphasized stronger tax administration and domestic resource mobilization as foundations for sustainable development financing. So from your perspective of an African intergovernmental organization that is supporting tax administrations, how can governments strengthen tax systems in ways that build public trust through greater transparency, accountability, fairness, and effective tax administration, while simultaneously enhancing their capacity to access the much needed finance at a lower cost? I will give you 7 minutes as well. Ms. Kitui, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Judith. I will try stick to the 7 minutes indicated. So let me just, first of all, just start off by thanking UNCTAD for this very timely meeting. And of course, the presenter as well, Keith, and my brother Olomo, Dr. Olomo as well, for the interventions. So maybe just to start off from where we sit in ATAF and the previous speakers is, first of all, recognizing, as has mentioned, that the terms of borrowing have worsened in terms of debt. We are looking at maturity levels shortened over the past few years from 15 to 10 years in terms of maturity. Interest rates continue to go up. What this means from an ATAF perspective is that there has been growing pressure for domestic resource mobilization. And in that context, what that means also is that there has been a growing interest in tax revenue for domestic resource mobilization and development financing on the continent. That has put an immense pressure on tax revenue and tax administrations to ensure that there is an administrative process of ensuring that revenue collection. For us, that means supporting infrastructure, education, healthcare, energy, and several sectors of the government's budget scheme within that financial year. That context has shown us that about 60 to about 80% of national budgets now require revenue through taxation, putting immense pressure on tax administrations. Over the past few years, this tells us that, and I think Keith has also alluded to that external financing continues to reduce. And this reduction has moved around 11%, requiring more national and domestic resource mobilization. Now, for ATAF, we don't believe entirely that all revenue should be domestically sourced through taxation. However, we source this to consider it as a complementarity pillar towards sustainable development and financing on the continent and more nationally oriented. So to be able to support that, we also recognize that through taxation, we place the interest on states' priorities. We place the interest on state sovereignty as well as a big emphasis towards its credit worthiness and support through the global financial architecture as well. Now, when we speak of taxation, we also recognize that the level of tax to GDP ratio on the continent remains to be quite significantly low in comparison to other continents on the globe. For Africa, for example, we talk about a ratio of about 16% of tax to GDP. And these statistics have also been resonated within the publication that we have co-authored with the African Union and OECD. And in there, what we've also recognized through this publication is that about 19% of tax to GDP is within Asia, about 33.9% within OECD countries. This tells you that there is still significant room for us on the continent to improve our domestic resource mobilization efforts through taxation. But one of the caveats that I would also like to put out there is that we're not talking about increasing taxation, but naturally about widening the tax base, increasing elements of efficiency and efficiency within our tax systems. Now, this tells you, and the growing interest through the trends of taxation is that there is a request for increase in capacity initiatives, increase of technical assistance, and one of the more efficient measures that we're also seeing ourselves push ourselves into is digitization for systemic approaches and innovation within that space. Now, what that tells you is that you also see areas of taxation improvement in compliance, stronger governance support, policy formation, and I think Dr. Lom has also mentioned this when he was talking about the STC, conversations with ministers of finance and what that means about tax compliance and governance and policy orientation. But it also places the interest in legislative reforms on the continent that require that support therein. Now, when we get into more details of how ATAF and the position of this also sees is that we see the development agenda being a multifaceted approach for financing. The global reduction of ODA has showed us that alternative sources of financing are required, more sustainable approaches, and a multi-factor approach of systems and institutions are required to ensure that there's a sense of sustainability. But what that still tells you is that for tax administrations, there is a key interest in strengthening tax administration support for delivery mechanisms. Over the past 10 years or so I should give the period of 2016 to about 2024, what we've also seen is that there's been an increase of interventions and requests from tax administrations and ATAF in particular, with, for example, more than about 5.3 billion in additional tax assessments have been done by us in ATAF. That has also moved now into an additional collection of about 2.1 billion in additional revenue. 4.7 of that is, of course, more specific to areas like transfer pricing, VAT as well, and cross-border taxation. It tells you that there is a need for continued cross-relations of states, transfer pricing-oriented support, for the ability to basically tap into what is already available. So compliance of systems, development of policies become quite paramount in that perspective. Now, while we consider this, what we've also considered is that there is a need for international corporations around this. And we see ourselves working closer with yourselves in UNCTAD, to see ourselves building on the relationships, of course, with the African Union, and ensuring that we are able to tap into the financial development agendas that we've all collectively committed ourselves to. So I will stop there because I do know I had particularly 7 minutes, but simply just to share the reflections that the paramount interest of taxation remains quite a key interest on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kitui, for your intervention and sort of giving us the issues around taxation. So taken together with the presentation of Dr. Olomo, we've now had two perspectives that are closely connected. One on the need for more supportive international and regional financing and environment, and then also the importance of strengthening domestic fiscal foundation. So thank you both, Dr. Olomo and Ms. Kitui, for your interventions. We would now like to open the floor for interventions, questions, and comments from the floor. I note, however, that we have just about 15 minutes to the close of this webinar. I will beg your indulgence to increase it by another 15 minutes so we can complete at 4, we can finish at 4:15, just to give us a little bit of time to get some questions and interventions from the floor, and also give an opportunity to our panelists as well as the presenter to respond to these questions. And I invite you to raise your hand should you wish to take the floor, and would also be especially happy to hear from any government representatives that are present here about the national level measures that you might be pursuing in your countries to lower borrowing costs and protect fiscal space, and also how the ministries of finance especially are navigating the pressures and policy trade-offs involved in managing debt service alongside development priorities. So if you would like to take the floor, please do raise your hand. So let me see if I can see. Okay, I do not see any requests for the floor now. But we do have some questions in the chat box, which I will read through. So I think we'll take just these questions and invite the panelists to respond to those. So there's a great point on mispricing vis-a-vis oversubscribed issuances, and it would be interesting to see who is advising treasuries in these instances. So I guess this is a question to Keith. Is this an area where UNCTAD and any other agencies that we might be aware of are providing specific technical assistance? The second question is also to Keith. I think the report raises the very pertinent facts and realities. However, the broader challenge of financing development also exposes some of the risks embedded in loan contracts and financing agreements, including extreme default clauses. The presentation also touched on concerns relating to stocks and bonds. In addition, another key financing challenge is the need for a financial architecture that can prevent misuse, embezzlement, and weak accountability. So the question is, beyond attracting financial capital and managing the cost of finance, what kind of financing framework is needed to ensure that financing actually supports development outcomes? How can such a framework address risk related to loan conditions, default clauses, and debt sustainability? What safeguards or accountability mechanisms should be built into development financing to prevent embezzlement or misuse of the funds? The next question is, let me see if I can say this right. To Dr. Olomo, thank you for the presentation. As you rightly said, the African Union has increasingly emphasized the need to shift the narrative from debt sustainability to productivity. How does the African Union envisage embedding this approach within the borrowers platform, the UNCTAD's borrowers platform, so that debt-financed investments are assessed not only by the size of the debt they create, but by their capacity to generate growth, employment, exports, and revenues that strengthen their ability to service that debt? So I think since there are no other requests for the floor, I will invite, maybe I'll start with Keith, then I'll come to Dr. Olomo, and then to Ms. Kitui, and we'll close off the panel, the Q&A session at that. So Keith, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Judith. So just in terms of the first question around this question of mispricing of new issues and whether oversubscription is a good thing. I mean, obviously, when you're issuing a bond, you want to make sure you do have full placement. So a small level of oversubscription is not a terrible thing. But there is a question if you start getting to these very heavily oversubscribed issues, is how much are is the government that's issuing those bonds leaving on the table then, because those costs are going to persist for the term of that loan issue, or that bond issue rather. And there is a question of whether the advisors and the incentives that they operate under are well aligned with the interests of the country. So I think there's a few things there. Firstly, it would help if countries were doing more regular issues, so that they have a better sense of where the market is at and what the market perceptions of risk and things are, to guide their pricing decisions. But I think it's also important to look at the incentives that exist for advisors, and maybe to structure them in a different way. UNCTAD doesn't provide specific technical assistance in this area, but I think it is something where it could be an area. I don't want to lay too much on the borrowers platform, but it could ultimately be an area where peer learning amongst borrower platform member states enables countries to get a better feel for how they should go about things and how they could reduce their costs of issues. In terms of the second question on attracting capital and managing those costs, I think a key point here, and it links to Patrick's point about productive debt, is that we have to start looking at not just the sources of financing and the cost, but how the financing is used. And I think the same point could be made in respect of additional domestic resource mobilization through taxation. It's all good and well to raise additional revenue, but if you don't spend it in a way that ultimately generates an economic benefit on it and expands the capacity to service debt and the capacity of the country to grow faster, then you have a challenge, because it's essentially like a leaking bucket. Of course, the challenge with development is that some of the investments that we need to make have a long payback period. So investments in education are not going to give you an immediate return that enables you to service the debt that you might have used to fund that education spending. Likewise, in the health space and infrastructure perhaps. So it is important that we get a balance. If we borrow money or raise additional taxation, we have to use that money in a range of ways that enhances the medium and short-term capacity of the economy to grow and generate additional resources, but at the same time, the longer term as well. So I think there has to be a much stronger focus on the building of productive assets. So what is borrowed money and additional finance used to finance, and how is that helping the economy move forward and develop in the process? So in terms of the practicalities of that, I think there has to be a much stronger reporting focus on the assets that are built, and so people can see tangible outcomes from the additional debt that's being incurred. Okay, in terms of managing risks and limiting embezzlement, I think the key thing here is that we need legislative frameworks that promote greater transparency in financing generally, but also in debt. So what are the terms of loans that are entered into, the conditions attached to them? And I think it's in relation to all of these things. I mean, we often make the point that we should have more local currency loans because that reduces the risk to countries if their exchange rates move. But you also have to consider what is the cost premium of those kind of issues. So if in order to borrow in local currency terms, you have to pay a very significant premium, then you need to factor in, does that premium make sense for the benefits you're getting? Okay, I think that probably there's one more question here that you didn't raise, but we can maybe get back to that after Patrick's intervention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Katie. I think this is the question on the role of economic diplomacy. We'll come back to that. So Dr. Olomo, over to you on the African Union embedding the approach of debt productivity in the borrowers platform.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thanks for the very, very important question. What I want to say is that we have consistently been highlighting that the issue of Africa's debt is a two-way highway, because borrowers and also the creditors have the responsibility of ensuring that debt be productive. That is a credo that we have been insisting on since we accessed the G20 as permanent member, and we have highlighted the fact that it is important that on both the creditor side and the borrower side, that there is, that fair allocation of responsibilities in terms of the outcome of the debt. Now, it is our ultimate responsibility as Africans to ensure that when we also contract debt, that debt speaks to the issue of productive investment and productive transformation. We are bringing on the borrowers platform the most important contribution, because we are 55 African Union member states that are participating in that process. And it is the most important regional presence in that platform. So our voice will certainly be amplified by the fact that we represent 22% of the global population, and that there are even expectations that we will be, nearly 30 or 35% in the 2 to 3 decades ahead of us. So for us, we absolutely believe that it is timely and opportune to elevate the discussion in the borrowers platform to shift the narrative from that only narrow perception of debt sustainability that speaks to the issue of repayment of the debt itself, and that is not preventing us from falling into future debt difficulties, as we have seen repeatedly over time. You do recall that in the 80s, we had the same problem. In the 90s, we had the same problem. In the 2000s, earlier, we had the same problem. And now in the 2020, we are facing the same problem. So we at the African Union would like to break that vicious cycle and use the borrowers platform as, I don't want to say a platform, as an instrument that will allow borrowing countries to mature the discussion on how they can better position themselves in the global debt environment, to make sure that they shift from the narrow perception of sustainability to the very productive perception of productive investment using debt that is contracted. So that is what we are aiming to do. And we absolutely do believe that breaking the vicious cycle of debt would only be possible if we become productive. Let me give one example. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a market of 1.4, 1.5 billion people today. And expectations are showing that we may be a market of 2.7 billion people in 2060, which will be the population combined of India and China. It is a huge market that needs to be exploited in terms of producing the goods that our people are going to consume. When you take the balance sheet, as was highlighted by Kit, if you take our balance of payment, you will see that most of the item that we are importing can be produced locally. And it speaks to food, it speaks to, the clothes that we are, wearing, shoes, and all those, articles that can be produce on the continent, we have to concentrate on productive transformation, because that is the only way we will raise the revenue, as was said by my sister Leila, that will allow us to be able to finance our development and also to pay back the debt that we have contracted. It is also important that we work on breaking the vicious cycle of the perception, the wrong perception that the international community has on the continent. Africa, as I said, is certainly the less riskier continent in the world in terms of investment. But unfortunately, the premium that is placed on the continent has consistently shifted the narrative, bringing us to the high cost of capital that we are experiencing today. And that will certainly, if not addressed, will continue to harm the continent. So our ultimate goal at the African Union is to make sure that we present another face of the continent. We are doing this with platforms such as the Africa Virtual Investment Platform that we launched recently during our ministerial session in Abidjan. It can be checked online. We are bringing our countries to understand that they have to market the investment opportunities that they have. They have to present the reforms that they are implementing and also show how they are making progress towards structural transformation. This is the only way we will be able to break the vicious cycle of what perception is doing to the continent. Let's look at how countries are changing. Look at Ethiopia today. We are in Addis Ababa. If you look at how Addis is changing, are we sure that the world knows that the continent is changing at that speed and pace? I'm not sure. If you take Accra, have you been there? Have you seen how the country is changing? How, people are motivated, transforming, and showing another face of their countries. That is the story we need to market and the story we need to tell to our people and to the international community to make sure that we are not only punished by the adverse perception of risk that we have on the continent. There are several examples that we can take in that direction. We are shaping our future and we are making sure that it be built on the solid ground of effective implementation of policies that are shifting our way forward towards structural transformation. Africa is the continent of the future. We have said it consistently, and we are working to make sure that it becomes a reality. Thank you very much. And back to you, Judith.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olomo, for that perspective on how we can embed the productivity approach in the borrowers platform, but also concluding with the need to change the Africa's story and debunking the risk that debunking the idea that it's a very risky continent, with clear examples from Ethiopia and Accra. I'd now like to invite Ms. Kitui to give us some closing reflections, and perhaps if you could give our stakeholders and participants present here one key message from today's discussions, what would it be? Ms. Kitui?
Great, thank you for that, Judith. Just quick parting remarks is that one of the things that we keep emphasizing is that we need to consider widening the tax base, not largely about increasing the tax base. But what that also tells you is that we're looking towards building more efficiency in addressing the revenue leakages on the continent. And this is done through building better systems, addressing some of our legislative reforms that require us to be able to tap into that. All in all, that will of course assist us in addressing the IFF's agenda and the IFF's outflows on the continent, of course, which your report reflects the increase in outflows of resources on the continent. But also, it also helps us in relating to elements such as tax compliance and taxpayer education. One of the worst narratives that we have is that we're simply here as tax collectors to take and take. But what we want to emphasize is that one of this is the avenue for tax education and what that actually means for state sovereignty and the role of taxation in the larger development agenda. But it also taps into conversations around service delivery and the ambit in which taxation is utilized for service delivery and the improvement therein too, and of course the budget element too there. Now, setting this as a final step for me, I would say is that the collective effort of financing is a multi-factor attribute through both external revenue, internal revenue sources, but also looking into better systems application and the reviewing of those systems and how best that architecture. And I think that was one of the questions that was asked about the financial architecture and what that looks like. It also plays into a larger ambit of reviewing international diplomacy on the financial architecture, which of course conversations under the UN Tax Convention and conversations under the OECD framework also support the outlook in terms of financing development, but also lastly, placing an emphasis on the Agenda 2063 that we have and what elements we seek to actually be able to finance that. But also lastly, considering the elements around the Agenda 2030, which also places Africa in decline in terms of actually financing development around Agenda 2030 as well. So just a few parting shots there. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Kitui, and thank you to all our panelists as well as to Keith for the presentation. I think today's discussion has reinforced some very important points, specifically that financing development is as much about mobilizing more money as it is about creating the conditions under which developing countries can access finance that is affordable, predictable, sustainable, and aligned to their long-term development priorities. We have also had that addressing the financing challenge requires action on several points at the national level, at the regional level, at the international level, but also between external finance and domestic finance. I would like now to invite Keith to give us some closing remarks. Keith, I know there was an outstanding question from the panel session, and I will ask if you could embed this in your closing remarks on the role of economic diplomacy in bringing external finance, and also probably speak a little bit more on the issue of the borrowers platform. And just before I hand over to you, on behalf of UNCTAD, I would like to sincerely thank our speakers and all participants for joining us today and contributing to this important discussion, as well as to the UNCTAD team that organized this webinar. These issues are not only central to achieving the SDGs, but also advancing Africa's broader development agenda under Agenda 2063. We do hope that the discussion has provided useful insights and importantly contributed to continued conversations on practical solutions for financing sustainable development. Before I hand over to Keith, I would also like to invite participants to please open your videos so that we can have an opportunity to take a family photo while the closing remarks are being given. So Keith, over to you, and thank you very much, everybody.
Yes, thank you to Judith and your team in Addis Ababa for all the work you've put into making this webinar work, and thanks to Patrick and Leila for your contributions as well. I really appreciate it. And to all the participants who've been online, I hope you found the discussions interesting. I think just in closing, there was a sort of outstanding question about economic diplomacy. And we're currently engaged with the borrowers platform. There's diplomacy issues at work in the context of negotiating modalities and things that are an indication of member states engaging with the process and taking ownership of it. But I think economic diplomacy also extends, and this links to some of what Patrick said about countries telling their own stories. And it also links then to my point about making sure that credit rating agencies are not the only avenue that communicates with markets on your behalf. So taking direct control of that process, telling the world what's happening in your countries, what's going on, what your plans are, and selling those ideas in the international marketplace, I think is really important. Communicating with financial markets directly is an important way of reducing the risk profile, and in that process, reducing borrowing costs or your financing costs in general, but also expanding your access to finance. Because when you come up with good programs and projects, inevitably there will be financing that is attracted to it. And the more competition you have to put financing in, the better terms you'll be able to negotiate, both in terms of the interest rates you're paying or the maturities that are available. So I think that's a critical thing, and it is something that countries could take their own ownership of. So I think that's a good point to leave this discussion on as we go.
Thank you, Keith. That covers your closing remarks as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Keith. And once again, I'd like to thank you all participants for joining us for this important discussion. We will be sharing the presentation as well as the full report with you all with the emails that you have registered. We'll give you an opportunity to go through some of the findings more thoroughly, and we will remain available should you have any additional questions after reviewing the report. Thank you very much, and wish you all a good afternoon or evening. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.